Hello and welcome to the Prevalence of Crime Amongst Psychopaths, an inquiry. I am your host, Tom Lynch. I will be carrying you through this presentation, and hopefully for you, it is painless. Pun intended. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about today is the perception of psychopaths that is portrayed to people in the media. Well, unfortunately, what Hollywood gives you is not really what a psychopath is. Hollywood has a tendency of sensationalizing this disease. What they do is they take many of the characteristics that we see in paranoid schizophrenics and they apply them to the Hollywood psychopath. So, this is where you get your quintessential psychopath from. He might sit in a room full of newspaper clippings and he might be sweating profusely, rocking back and forth, looking left and right, and he might hear voices in his head that are telling him to kill, kill, kill. And he eventually leaves his apartment and he goes out onto the street and he's all bugged out looking and, he abducts somebody and he murders them. Well, that's just really a false perception of what a psychopath is. When thinking about psychopaths, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that there is a failure to experience empathy. When a psychopath looks at somebody who's suffering, they don't see themselves in that person and say, oh, that poor person, because they don't relate it back to themselves the way that normal people do. A recent study showed that there may actually be an empathy switch within the mind of a psychopath where, if requested to feel empathy, they can think about it and they can feel empathy. But normally, when they're going through their everyday routine, there's an absence of it. And it's the lack of empathy that's really the driving force behind any deviant behavior. And that's because a lot of psychopath behavior is self driven. And if you are not empathetic towards others, then other people are expendable, especially when they stand in between you and your goal. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about in this opening statement, which is important to know, is there is actually no diagnosis officially for psychopathy. Instead, psychopathy is scored on a checklist, which we'll talk about a little later, but there is no official diagnosis for psychopathy in the DSM 5. Instead, psychopathy falls under the umbrella of antisocial personality disorder. And that's important to know. Okay, so an important name to know when you're talking about psychopaths is Hervey Cleckley. Hervey Cleckley was a pioneer in psychopathology. He actually invented the psychopath checklist, which later becomes revised by a chap called Robert D. Hare. Hervey Cleckley is also well touted in the realm of psychopathology, especially for his contribution in the form of the book The Mask of Sanity, which is still used today. Okay, so without further ado, let's discuss the PCLR a little bit. Again, that's the Psychopathy Checklist revised. Basically, there are 20 categories, and you can score a maximum of 40 points. Anything between 30 and 40 points is considered a psychopath. The 20 items are as follows: glib and superficial charm, grandiosity, the need for stimulation, pathological lying, cunning and manipulativeness, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, callousness and lack of empathy, parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral controls, sexual promiscuity, early behavioral problems, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, failure to accept responsibility for one's own actions, many short-term marital relationships, juvenile delinquency, revocation of conditional release, and criminal versatility. Most people will score some way on this test, but very few will actually achieve a score of 30 to 40. This test must be administered in a standardized way and administered by a professional. There are unofficial online versions of it, but I wouldn't go by those. Now let's talk about confounding variables for a moment. There are a few confounding variables that can contribute to a psychopath's severity. These include a socio-economical background. What I mean by this is we know that poverty can give rise to crime. Did the individual grow up in a poverty-stricken neighborhood? Was the individual exposed to gang violence? Was it commonplace where the person grew up to get into fights? These are all socioeconomical variables to take into consideration. Another variable is childhood abuse. A 2015 study indicated that the severity of overall childhood maltreatment was linked to severity of both psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. What this means is, while we don't know if childhood abuse can cause a person to become a psychopath, we are pretty certain that it can amplify the severity of the psychopathy. Okay, and just like that, we're on to the meat and potatoes of this research. So, the actual prevalence of crime within psychopaths is quite shocking. Psychopaths are 20 to 25 times more likely to be in prison than non-psychopaths. Psychopaths are 4 to 8 times more likely to violently recidivate compared to non-psychopaths. They are resistant to most forms of treatment. There are approximately 1,150,000 male psychopaths in America. Of that figure, 93% of them are in prison. This is a shocking number. As I just mentioned, that's a very shocking, staggering number that 93% of all male psychopaths are in prison. This research was performed by Keel and Hoffman in 2011, and I think what it fails to address, aside from the fact that it's a male-centric study and they're not really speaking about women, I think it fails to address the psychopaths who are not on the radar, the psychopaths who are mixed in with the rest of society. There is a lot of information out there regarding psychopaths that says they're not exactly all criminals. In fact, many psychopaths become CEOs of companies, they become bankers, they become financial officers. Many psychopaths choose career paths that lead to monetary gain. I think that this study simply disregards this, and I think that further research is warranted. In conclusion, I thank you for listening. I implore you to keep in mind that crime and antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy is a highly debated topic. And I also implore you to be open minded to the fact that there is always new research being performed and new statistics emerging. Thank you.